I hope sharing some of my experiences of processing the racism I dealt with will better equip you to process your own. Better yet, I hope you didn't have to face it. Everyone attending this event is already better off than where I was in college. If you're Asian, you've already recognized that you want to examine and appreciate more of your Asian identity. And for those who aren't Asian, you want to learn about a new culture. I grew up in a very white town as one of a handful of Asian students in my school system. I was proud of my ability to be a racial and cultural bridge builder. In college, I took pride in having friends of all races and being one of the only non-Latine people in the Latin student organization. Although being a cultural bridge builder, learning and bonding over the commonalities and struggles of other cultures is important and a worthy cause, it took me a while to realize that there was self-hate involved with that too. My white teachers weren't racially literate enough to teach me and my white classmates the vocabulary to differentiate between hating the racism and dehumanization I faced for being Asian and hating being seen as Asian. Asian was inaccurately interlinked with adjectives like nerdy, uncool, unpopular, uncreative, and other negative traits by a straight white male-dominated media industry that consistently perpetuated these ideas ubiquitously. These racist ideas infiltrated every aspect of society and existence. My parents were focused on surviving in a country that has normalized anti-Asian racism, and weren't equipped to teach me these things either. Growing up, I used to always hate it when other Asian people not in my family would stand near me because white people so often would say, "Are you together?" when we looked nothing alike. This was frustrating because it reinforced the dehumanizing idea that Asians are interchangeable, not identifiable, and all look the same. I also hated the anti-Asian jokes my white peers would make, thinking that was a way to bond with each other or bond with me. In high school and younger, sometimes I'd try to take control of that hurt and pain and make the jokes myself in a satirical way, but my white peers never interpreted it that way and saw it as an invitation to make more of those jokes around me. And behind my back too. They started saying things like I was cool for being able to take a joke. Back then I was flattered by the cool compliments. It took me a while to realize how messed up that was and to stop making those jokes and to openly criticize those jokes. I started seeing how ingrained the mockery of people of color is in white written stories, movies, TV shows, and overall in white identity formation, and I hope all people start realizing that as a problem, and white folks work on not having that be so integral to their identity. There are many Asian public figures who are still making these anti-Asian jokes, probably for similar reasons I had in high school, and wish they'd stop too. For example, it was great to see an Asian American candidate on the presidential stage to show that president is a possibility for future Asian American generations. It was positive to see policies presented that weren't previously commonly discussed on the presidential level, regardless of how people feel about whether they'd worked in practice. However, Andrew Yang's use of dehumanizing Asian stereotypes as an attempt of humor causes harm, especially for reinforcing the racism involved with the model minority myth. Please look that up if you're unaware of it. That's a whole other loaded conversation. It's important to scrutinize the white folks around him, both now and when he was growing up, who rewarded him, perhaps by calling him cool for being able to take a joke, and ask what it says about them to think this makes a person of color cool. However, he needs to take responsibility as an adult for the harm the jokes cause. I'm glad that we're at a point where Andrew Yang isn't that high a percentage of Asian American male portrayals that I feel more comfortable criticizing him publicly without feeling like I'm bringing down such a high percentage of Asian American men. Still, I wish there was far more representation because it's still such a high percentage. White men, for example, do not have to worry about one white man representing their entire race. However, it's on everyone to recognize that Asian Americans and other people of color are overall underrepresented, and no one person can represent anyone besides their own individual selves. Recognizing that our society isn't there yet, I question whether Yang being on the debate stage making these kind of harmful comments was overall progress or not. Occasionally, I try to keep these criticisms in a conversation with other Asian people, or extending it to non-Asian people of color, but I think public criticism, even in the presence of white folks, is necessary to keep raising standards. In college, it was still very white, but less white than my high school. It was frustrating when white students would ask why all the Asian students are sitting together without examining why they are surrounded only by white people. These frustrating, socially unaware comments from white peers led me to not want to join the Asian culture groups, even though they were doing cool things. It took me a while to reframe that frustration as frustration for how socially inept those white people are. My closest white friends actively work on avoiding this. I'm frustrated that I was surrounded by all that and put in a position where I hated being seen as Asian, but I've learned to forgive myself for it. I hated being associated with Asianness, partially because there weren't many humanizing portrayals of Asians in media, and especially positive, three-dimensional, charismatic portrayals. I hated the anti-Asian racism. I didn't hate being Asian. That's a crucial difference to internalize. It's important to recognize that we don't need to wait for validation from white people or white institutions like the Academy Awards. We have to take control of our own narratives instead of begging for a seat at a white table, for example. Although fighting for more accurate representation in Hollywood and at awards shows is important, we have to prioritize making our own tables, ones that fight for humanity and value what we and other marginalized people bring to the table, ones that have our own innovative vision for the world we want to live in. I have my own vision of what that looks like, and that involves having higher standards for white people to show basic levels of human empathy when it comes to race. But I encourage you to develop your own. I've used my photography to help tell stories of people of color the way I want them to be told, three-dimensional and humanized. When I take portraits, especially of people of color, I make sure I'm capturing their humanity and centering them, both literally and figuratively. It's difficult to capture the entire range of humanity in one photo, but I make sure the connection through the eyes is there. I also try to add my own artistic vision and creativity to the portrait, so even if the range of humanity isn't fully represented, the fact that an Asian American artist was behind the creativity is impactful. White storytellers are more likely to have inaccurate perceptions based on previous, inaccurate, and dehumanizing white-created ideas of what people of color are like, and too often see them as side characters, a part of a white protagonist's journey, and not people who have their own journey. These attitudes show up in photos and in other media, causing harm to everyone, including white people. Recognizing this harm and the limitations of so much of white-created media has been a key to my journey of dealing with racist generational trauma. To the white folks listening, I encourage you to consistently learn how to be more empathetic and responsible when it comes to fighting against racism. This is Steve Terada, co-founder of Quest Crew, which won America's Best Dance Crew, and he was on So You Think You Can Dance. I don't recall many examples of humanized, creative Asian people portrayed in media prior to YouTube and dance competition shows. YouTube eliminated many white-created and perpetuated barriers to telling our own stories. He was also a dancer at the Oscars for the Sun Lux performance. Michelle Kwan, 5-time world champion and legend in figure skating and U.S. ambassador to Belize. Yo-Yo Ma. Both Kwan and Yo-Yo Ma are praised for artistry, performing with emotion, but often framed by white folks as an exception to the idea of Asians being only technically good. I want everyone to break away from this idea of an Asian exception and focus more on accurately telling the range of Asian humanity. Asian art, Asian creativity, Asian emotion has always been there. White storytellers simply haven't told enough of those stories accurately. Daniel Kwan, co-writer, director of Everything Everywhere All at Once. It just swept major awards during award season, which felt like a win for all Asian Americans, but the film was great even without the validation of all these awards. Bong Joon-ho from Parasite called the Oscars a local awards show, and really it's been an awards for white filmmakers. It's important to remember that awards shows and Hollywood are late to recognizing Asian creativity and talent, which has always been there. It didn't just pop up in the last few years. Michelle Yeoh's talent, for example, has always been there for decades. Non-Asian people are just late recognizing it. Kwan, along with his co-writer, was able to write humanizing roles for Asians. When I was young, watching Michelle Yeoh act in white-written stories, I had a visceral negative reaction to hearing Michelle Yeoh's accent. Her line from Bond, "Don't get any ideas," was something I made fun of when I was younger. Yes, it was probably progress from previous women in Bond films, but not great. It was a reaction of embarrassment because white writers forced the link between accents like hers speaking English with dehumanization, rather than the beauty of learning a second or third, fourth, fifth, etc. language, moving to a new place and starting a whole new challenging adventure in life. We need more complex and humanizing roles for Asian people with accents like Yeoh's. I wish I had watched more Asian cinema growing up, as in films written, made, directed by Asian people in Asia, but I was most exposed to American cinema, which has been largely white male dominated. Paul Sung-hyun Lee, Appa from Kim's Convenience and Star Wars. This was a show that humanized Appa and Uma, characters that are Korean immigrants to Canada, so the actors, despite not having an accent, faked an accent in their acting. This was a heartwarming, humanizing, and hilarious show. Appa and Uma had dreams, goals, flaws, and were far from one-dimensional. Towards the later seasons, I heard Jin Yoon, who plays Uma, discuss how they had essentially pushed out all the Asian writers, and it really showed in how the episodes were written. This is really frustrating to hear, but the show still had a lot of positive impact in the earlier seasons. Simu Liu. Seeing Simu blow up in the last few years has overall been positive. I look forward to the projects he'll be a part of in his future, and hope he focuses less on making statements that imply being a Marvel superhero is some pinnacle in his career. There are many positives of the film version of Shang-Chi and the fact that Asians were given the opportunity to make that white-created superhero better. However, Simu Liu is an immensely talented person with wide-ranging talents, and he's bound for greater things than that. Marvel characters have white-written origins, and it causes problems. The comic Shang-Chi and the characters they made had racist and exotified origins, for example. I hope that hearing my brief criticisms, which I could go far more in depth with, will inspire you to be consistently holding people to high standards. I would love to see more Asian American created stories and superhero stories, and think we need to dream bigger than starring as a character with racist origins created by white writers. However, other people's stories will always have limitations, so we all need to make sure that we're telling our own too. Having flaws is part of humanity though, and I encourage you to put your own stories out there without any expectation of perfection. Breaking cycles of generational trauma involves being critical of what exists, recognizing how it's affected you both positively and negatively, and taking control of how you'd like things to be. This doesn't need to be through art, writing, or movies. It can be through daily conversations with others or other actions. We can't let other people define who we are. We have to define it ourselves. Even with my best attempts of trying to humanize all the people I photograph, or inspire others by sharing how I've dealt with trying to break cycles of generational trauma, my art and what I say will have limitations too, so please make your own judgments of the way to move forward. I'm very impressed and hopeful that discussion of generational trauma is being normalized, and I'm overall inspired that people have communities and are less alone in dealing with it. I hope that my experiences can help better equip you to fight against racism, and inspire you towards self-love, especially of your own ethnic and cultural identity.